And we're the Y'all Show. Talk with a Southern accent, talk with an American accent too, and we're going to get very American and very historic right now on the show that covers everything Southern because we're going to talk about presidential politics, specifically historic presidential politics. We're going to kind of rate America's president, and we're going to do that thanks to author Robert Spencer. He's joining us right now. He is a UNC alum, and his new book is Rating America's President, out on Bombardier Books. Robert, welcome into the show that's all about the South.
Great to see you, John. Great to be here. Thank you.
And it's not too difficult of a challenge to have you talk about y'all and y'all people, are you?
No, sir. I was
Okay.
born in Charleston, South Carolina, and as you noted, I went to UNC.
Hey, Robert, I got to ask this question. Are you ready for it? It might be the toughest question you've ever been asked.
Okay.
Are you a SOB? And he's
uh,
laughing because you know what I'm talking about.
well, I got to confess, I think that this is something else. I'm not sure that I'm thinking of what you were thinking of. So maybe.
SOB, I don't know what you're thinking of, but I'm talking about South abroad.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, I haven't thought of that in a million years. No, I am not one. I was not from there. I grew up on James Island.
Ah, there you have it. Okay. Yep,
Yes,
you probably ran across a few of my cousins over there on James Island, as that's
probably
a
so.
lovely, lovely area of our South, the Charleston area, but a native of Charleston. And then, as I said, you went to college at that other Carolina. And
Yep.
what did you study when you were there?
I studied English literature and then religious studies for a master's, and been working on that kind of thing ever since. Mostly have written about jihad terrorism and related issues. This is my first book on American history, but I'm very happy to have done it because it's something I've been interested in since I was a very small child. As a matter of fact, it's probably before your time, but there was a guy on WCSC in Charleston, Charlie Bird Lindsay. I used to call into his call in show and talk to him about American history and the presidents when I was about 7. And so I've been working on this ever since.
Robert, I know Charlie. I knew Charlie Bird Lindsay when I
Oh, yeah.
was hanging out in Charleston, going to one of the colleges there in the area. He worked at the Weasel. I think it was, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Weasel. And then he left the Weasel and worked when I was in college at Bubba 107.5. Now, is that a great radio station?
That one I'm not familiar with. That might have been after I left.
It's rest in peace now, but for a while there, it was giving the Weasel a run for its money there in the Low Country. But yeah,
It's great name.
WBUB Bubba
Huh.
107.5. And I'm glad that Charlie Bird actually helped me on my path to Nashville back when I was leaving the Low
Fantastic.
Country. So great, great gentleman. Great gentleman.
Yeah.
Hadn't thought about him in a while, but thank you for that great memory. Your book out, Rating America's Presidents, as you said, it's sort of your first historic dive into American presidents. You've kind of carved out a niche talking about jihadists. In fact, you have the website jihadwatch.org. On social media, you're at jihadwatchrs. And I actually, at a simple Google search of you, there's a couple of people, I think, in Montgomery, Alabama, that aren't big fans of what you've done with this whole jihadist deal. That's the Southern Poverty Law Center. They're a hater of you, Robert. So explain to people what exactly you've done prior to writing Rating America's Presidents.
Well, the Southern Poverty Law Center, of course, is a far left hate group that smears and uh, defames anybody who dissents from the far left agenda. And so I have spoken honestly about how Islamic jihadis use the texts and the teachings of Islam to justify violence and terrorism, and they think that's a terrible thing and say it's racist and so on. Although Islamic jihadis are of all races, this is not a racial thing. But they are a very insidious group because they're very wealthy and they're very powerful, they're very influential. And so when they say that you are a member of a hate group, then a lot of people run the other way. But it's completely spurious. It has no basis in reality. And it's interesting to note that they have been sued successfully for millions of dollars by people that they falsely put on their list. I'm looking at suing them myself if I can. And they've put people like Ben Carson on their list. It's a total joke. It's just if you are not a far leftist, then you're liable to get on their list.
I see. I just had to ask the question again because one of the reasons you might want to sue is when someone looks up author Robert Spencer, their explanation of who you are comes up first. And I
Well,
know,
that's because of Google. And
yeah,
Google is all in line with the same agenda. People think Google is just a search engine. It's not. It's got a far left agenda, just like the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's increasingly manipulating search results so that you will only get the kinds of things they want you to see about people. So if it's somebody on the right, then they show you everything negative that they can. And if it's somebody on the left, then they will show you all this material to make you think he's a big hero.
understood. Okay, as you said, this is a little bit of a different little deal now talking about presidents, and we have you on to talk about rating America's presidents. What led you to make this transition from jihadi writing to presidential writing?
Well, this is my 20th book. The other 19 have been pretty much all about various aspects of jihad terrorism. So I was ready to think about something else. And I think that it was important to write this in light of the left's war on history that we've seen very strongly this summer with them pulling down statues and trying to make Americans ashamed of being American, ashamed of our history and our heritage. That needed a pushback, but it hasn't just been this summer. It's been going on for years, and it's based on these principles that America is this racist, colonialist, imperialist entity that there's nothing good about. I thought that what we need is a reassertion of the principles that did make America great and an evaluation of American history, and particularly the presidents themselves, based on whether they left America stronger, more prosperous, and safer than it was before they became president, or whether they made it weaker and poorer and more dangerous. And it was on that basis I evaluated all 45.
Again, the full title of this book is Rating America's Presidents, an America First look at who is best, who is overrated, and who was an absolute disaster. And this is no simple read. This is a 560-page book. A lot of trees had to be cut down for this one.
They grow back.
Yeah, they do, except for the one over there on James Island. Uh, what is that? The angel oak tree. We don't want to cut that one down, but yeah, this is out again on Bombardier Books, and it's now available in hardcover as well for you to check out. Robert Spencer's book, Rating America's President. So, what were the factors? How did you determine in your rating system who was first and who was 45th?
It was just basically America first. America first is a very important principle that has been widely misunderstood and misinterpreted, and people have associated it unfairly with racism and with anti-Semitism, things like that. It doesn't have any necessary connection to any of those things. What it's about is what the president articulated. It's about what he said when he said that he was not the president of the world, he was the president of the United States, and that he was going to put the interests of Americans first. So I looked at every presidency to see, were the interests of Americans put first? Was America better off, like I said, militarily, politically, economically, because of this presidency, or was it worse off in those ways? And so we end up with 4 presidents who I rate as the very highest, and 6 who are the very lowest, and quite a few of them, of course, in between to various degrees.
Could you give us a little example of some of those highs and lows?
Yeah. Well, there are, like I say, 4 presidents who got a 10 out of 10. And one of them is the man in the White House now. And I rated him that highly because, as I show in the book, he followed quite a few, actually, going back to 1989. He followed 30 years of presidents who were internationalists, who were weakening America, getting us involved in trying to improve the situation in other countries while the situation in America deteriorated. And he's not an internationalist. He's an American. And he wants to make America strong before we go out and make Somalia or Iraq or Afghanistan strong. And it's that on that basis that I rated him so highly. Of course, there are many other things that he did, getting the economy going before the coronavirus hit, and again now, of course, and cutting regulations that were harming American industry, American business, making it attractive for businesses to be here and not in Mexico or China. Ultimately, that will make Americans more prosperous. People have been complaining about his high tariffs and saying, well, it's going to make for prices higher. Well, it's going to make for prices higher in the short run, but in the long run, it's going to strengthen the American industries that hire more Americans. And that will be better in the long run for the country in general. And so there are many, many things that Trump has done. He's shown extraordinary energy over the 3.5 years he's been president now, and he's turned America around after 30 years of this dismal internationalism that has weakened us so drastically.
Okay, if you don't mind, give me one other president that you rate very high, maybe the one that goes furthest back in history.
Well, that would be George Washington himself. He was the first, and he was among the best. And I'll tell you one of the main reasons why. Of course, a principal reason why is because he set the stage. He delineated what it means to be president, and he set the parameters for what a president is.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a couple of other things he did. One was, interestingly enough, he put down insurrections, and he showed that federal power was not nothing, was not a matter of just something on paper, but was a real thing. And there was the famous whiskey rebellion when some whiskey producers were complaining about the taxes that they had to pay, and they said that they wouldn't pay. And none of us like to pay taxes, and we're not in favor of high taxes to be sure. But the principle here involved was, did the federal government actually even have the right to make such laws, and so on? And Washington asserted that right, and without it, the country would have dissolved long ago. Most importantly, though, he left. He did not stay in power until he died. Now, that might seem to be a small thing, and we take it for granted in the United States, but the United States actually has the only unbroken string in the last 200 plus years of peaceful transfers of power. And Washington set the precedent for the peaceful transfer of power when he voluntarily stepped down, and he didn't have to. He would have certainly been elected to a third term, and he could have been president as long as he wanted. But instead, he set the precedent for the idea that power was not always to be grasped no matter what, that presidents were public servants who would step aside in favor of other people when the time was right. And this has held all this time. Now, of course, we're hearing from one of the major parties that they may not accept the results of the election, and that some states may even secede. A lot of terrible nonsense coming out nowadays. Yeah, John Podesta said it the other day, the Hillary Clinton advisor, that Oregon and Washington, maybe California, should actually leave the Union if Trump is reelected. And this is the strongest challenge to the peaceful transfer of power and to the unity of the United States since the Civil War. And we may be heading for another.
We are wrapping up our conversation with South Carolina native Robert Spencer, whose latest book is Rating America's Presidents. And since we're a South-centric website and show here, Robert, I want to ask you, I'm kind of off the top of my head, rattle off the various Southern presidents that we've had. And without going into too much detail, just kind of give me a sentence, your thoughts on these presidents, if you don't mind. I guess if Washington was number one from the South, it would have been Madison, number three, or Jefferson. I should start with Jefferson. Jefferson, thoughts on him?
Jefferson was a better writer and a better theorist than he was a president.
Okay.
He is on Mount Rushmore because he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and because he was a key founding father, not because he had a wonderful, wonderful, successful presidency. It wasn't too terrible, but he did set an embargo on trade with France and England, which drastically weakened the United States economically. And so there, by my America First criterion, I have to take points away from him for that. But yeah, most of the early presidents were from Virginia, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, as well as Washington. Others later, including John Tyler. John Tyler is an underrated president. Of course, he has kind of an interesting reputation because he's the only president to die and be buried under a foreign flag. He was a senator for the Confederate States of America when he died and was buried under the flag of the Confederacy. And he's actually the only president to have been a member of a foreign Congress
Yeah.
after he was president. But John Tyler was actually quite an effective president who also put down insurrections, which is something that is of increasing interest nowadays, the way things are going. But also he also set an important precedent just in becoming president, because he became president. He was the first vice president to become president when the president died. And a lot of people were saying, oh, you're just the acting president and we're going to have a new election. And he said, no, the Constitution says the vice president becomes president when the president dies. And so I am fully the president, not the acting president, not temporary, and there's not going to be a new election. Now, here again, you might think that's not an important point, but actually it's key, because if he had said, yeah, okay, I'm only temporary and we'll have another election, then you open the United States to the danger of people thinking they can kill the president and force a new election. And that would have made the United States into many, many other unstable republics that we've seen around the world.
An odd twist, we've had three that I'm aware of, three 19th century Carolinians become presidents, and they all had connections to Tennessee as well. We're talking about Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson, also James K. Polk. Thoughts on those three?
Jackson, I think he gets a bad rap nowadays for the Cherokee Trail of Tears, the forcible movement of Cherokees out of the South and and really the East in general and into Oklahoma. Now, there's no doubt that a lot of people died on the way, that was a terrible thing. But the idea that this was some sort of planned genocide is hysterical leftist historical revisionism. It is not what happened. The reality is that Jackson recognized that there were very big problems in the compatibility of the two civilizations, and that the Indians were not interested in assimilating and living as citizens of the United States. And so there was either going to be perpetual war, or there was going to be a territory for one and a territory for the other. That's not a terrible thing. You can deduct points, and I did actually, for him essentially practicing collective guilt and blaming all of the Indians for the actions of the violent ones. But it was a very difficult situation. It was an intractable situation, really. And he did his best to solve it as well as he could. The main thing Jackson did, and also this has to go on Tyler's good side as well, is kill the bank. The Bank of the United States was the place where all the United States funds were kept, but it was a private corporation. And so it was essentially a huge, unaccountable, unelected elite that had massive power to influence the political situation. And they did it by bribing, essentially, giving loans to congressmen and senators, bribing them for their support. And Jackson recognized that this was totally against the American principle of the rule by the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so he refused to renew the charter of the bank. This was a huge political controversy at the time. Tyler destroyed his own political career by refusing also to renew the charter of the bank after Jackson had left office. And this is something that was one of the biggest issues of the early years of the Republic. But it's very important even nowadays, too, when we see Trump fighting the deep state. It's the same kind of thing. A bunch of unelected, shadowy, anonymous people who have arrogated tremendous power to themselves and are working against the will of the people as expressed in its elected officials. And so Trump has to kill the deep state just like Jackson killed the bank, or we're in big trouble.
All right, as we wrap up with you, you're the kind of guy that I could sit down all day with and have some sweet tea and shrimp and grits with, because you've got all this presidential
Great.
knowledge and history. And boy, I hate that we have to cut our conversation short. But before we do leave you, Robert Spencer, author of Rating America's Presidents, let's fast forward to this modern last 50 years or so in our Southern connections here. We've had George W. Bush, we've had Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and others that have had a somewhat Southern connection perhaps in the White House. Thoughts on any of those real quick?
Well, you know, I was glad to see Jimmy Carter become president back when I was a kid because he was from Georgia. I was from South Carolina. There was a certain sense of regional pride there. The first president from the South, arguably since the Civil War, unless you count Woodrow Wilson, who was born in Virginia. But he was a disaster, of course. He was a terrible president, weakened the country, especially on the international stage. He made drastic concessions to the Soviet Union as if the Soviet Union was there to stay, which all the conventional wisdom was that it was in those days. And it wasn't. Ronald Reagan said the evil empire is soon going to collapse. He was the only one saying it. All the experts said, oh, no, 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 you can't say that. And he turned out to be right. But Carter was terrible internationally. He was also terrible domestically with his energy crisis and the fact that oil prices were so high and there were such long lines at the gas pump. And all of that, he said, was because Americans were wasteful and were wasting energy, and now there were shortages and so on and so on. In reality, it was because there was overregulation of the oil industry. And once Reagan removed those regulations, then there was no more shortage and no more energy crisis. But Carter was making people put in solar panels and said, turn your heat down to 60 in the winter so that you won't waste energy and so on. It was all nuts, but it was also, of course, part of the nanny state government assertion of control over every aspect of our lives that we've seen the Democratic Party embrace to such a tremendous degree since Carter. But Carter was very much part of that.
All right. What about William Jefferson Clinton?
I can't say anything good about him either. I'm sorry. Of course, with him, it becomes a matter of massive personal corruption. He was very canny, though, very clever man. You got to give him credit. When he was impeached for perjury, the Democrats insisted, well, this is all about sex and you're just being puritanical and everybody's a sinner and so on. Well, okay, but that's not really what it was all about. What it really was all about was that he lied to a grand jury. And lying to a grand jury ought to be something that a president of the United States is held accountable for just as much as everybody else. But he successfully changed the subject, and he got Kenneth Starr, the prosecutor, to make his report all about what they did and what they didn't, so that it read like a pornographic novel. That wasn't the point. The point was he perjured himself, and yet the whole thing was lost. And so we have now this precedent of a double standard because the Democratic Party controls so much of the government apparatus, controls the media elites, controls the educational system, the entertainment industry, pretty much everything outside of Trump. There's a two-tier system of justice. And the Clintons are fantastically corrupt, but have never been prosecuted and probably never will be. And Bill Clinton got the ball rolling in that with his impeachment.
All right, that's Bill Clinton. I got to put a limiter on you. How did Bill Clinton do in terms of keeping America first?
Bill Clinton was not an America First president.
Okay.
Bill Clinton inherited Somalia from George H.W. Bush, and that was a terrible thing because there wasn't even any American military advantage. There was no point for us to be in Somalia, none whatsoever, except that it was a humanitarian mission. Well, it would be nice to be able to be humanitarian and take care of everybody else's problems. But meanwhile, our bridges and our highways are crumbling in the United States, and we're spending money and our resources and endangering our soldiers' lives, sending them out to Somalia to make things better there. It was wrong-headed from the start, and Bill Clinton made it even worse. He didn't get us in, but once we were in, then there was the Black Hawk incident, where an army helicopter or a military helicopter was downed, and then the corpses were mutilated. It was a terrible scene. You may remember it. And Bill Clinton withdrew our troops after that. So it looked like we cut and run. Now, you might say we had no purpose in being there in the first place, and that's absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. But Osama bin Laden was watching all this, and he said, look, the Americans had this Black Hawk incident. They cut and run. They are weak, they are cowardly, they are paper tigers, and now is the time to step up our jihad and take the jihad to them. And 9/11 happened. And it wasn't just 9/11 either. During the Clinton watch, there were attacks on American installations in Saudi Arabia. There was an attack on the USS Cole. All these were by Islamic jihadis and Osama bin Laden in particular. And Clinton passed up opportunities to kill Osama bin Laden and did nothing to resist the advance of Al Qaeda. It's 9/11 is on him, not on George W. Bush.
Okay, and as we wrap up with Robert Spencer, I do want to ask you to quickly sum up in your America First lens George W. Bush.
George W. Bush was another internationalist, and his take on 9/11, even though, like I just said, it wasn't his fault that it happened, but it certainly was his fault how he mishandled it afterward. In the first place, he went to the mosque a week later and he said, Islam is a religion of peace, and we have to be careful to be nice to our Muslim neighbors. Well, of course we should be nice to our Muslim neighbors, but he didn't have to tell us that. And when he said Islam is a religion of peace, he made it difficult and ultimately impossible for the US government to discuss and to study the motivating ideology of the terrorists who hit us on 9/11. And you know, it's an adage as old as warfare itself. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. So when he did that, he made it impossible for us to understand the enemy, and he prolonged this problem needlessly. He also invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which became boondoggles because he didn't want to just topple the people who had made war against us, but he wanted to make them Western-style stable democracies, which they were never going to be because they have no democratic tradition. And they actually have an actively anti-democratic tradition in Islamic Sharia law. And he never understood that. This led to him ultimately getting us deeply committed into these nation-building projects that were futile to start with. And they were tremendous sap on our money, our materiel, and our military strength. And they should have been ended long ago. And the president now is quite right to want to get us out of Afghanistan. It's far, far too long overdue.
Rating America's Presidents. It's the new book from Robert Spencer, who has actually led seminars for the FBI and the General Staff College of our military. And it's been an absolute joy to hear what he's got out in this latest book. You said this was your 20th book?
That's right.
Gosh, a writing machine. I can see you got a bunch of books there behind you. I guess all of those are your books, huh?
No, actually, I didn't write those. I got my books over here.
Okay.
But these are books I use for research.
Okay, Bombardier Books is the publisher. Again, 560 pages. You can find it on Amazon. Also go to Robert's website, jihadwatch.org, and his social media connection is at jihadwatchrs. Robert, thank you very much for coming on the Yall Show and giving us a little taste of rating America's presidents, and we appreciate your time.
It's an absolute pleasure, John. Thanks. Call me anytime.
All right, we'll do it. Robert Spencer, everybody. And that will wrap up our conversation with Robert, and we appreciate y'all for tuning in. We'll have more of the Yall Show coming up.